Yo, are we live? Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4. What's up? What's up? What's up, E? Thanks for joining me. Glad you can make it. How's it going, guys? How was your holiday? How was your Christmas? Did Santa bring you everything and anything you wanted? Let's see if you can bring us some sound. Let's do our sound check here. Are we even live? Yep, there we are. Let's see. All right. I can confirm through my very, very scientific sound check that we are, in fact, live. What's up, everyone? Merry Christmas. Happy New Year's. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Kwanzaa. Happy whatever the hell you celebrate. Hopefully, happy you're off of work. That really sucks if you have to work between Christmas and New Year's, right? That's like the worst time to work. Nobody at any jobs, no matter what the stakes of those jobs are, nobody's working that hard these couple of weeks. So I hope if you do have to work, I hope you are taking a chance to kick back and just absorb this as some content for you. Hope you can debate me on some things. Maybe you have some different takes. Go ahead and get in on the chat if you have those different takes. If you want to get in, change the conversation a little bit. I'm more than willing to do that in exchange, of course, for a little interaction on your behalf. We have a few things to talk about that I want to get to today. First off, a story about an hour and a half ago, 2 hours ago, just dropped by Post Wrestling, indicating some unsealed court filings that may implicate WWE, TKO, how the sale went down, and some other figures around the whole story that I do kind of want to just talk about. I have no idea what you're referring to there, E, but I'll trust you on that last chat. No idea. Also, in the spirit of end of year, we will commence the first annual Robbie Awards, the Robbies, as I'm calling them. And it'll be my own way of looking back at the year in wrestling. And I want to break down a few common categories that you see in end of year award shows for wrestling and non-wrestling, but then some unique categories, maybe some explainers, and we'll talk about it all here in a second. For now, though, I want to get to what the big story is that the guys at Post Wrestling just posted. So give me like 2 seconds here. Sorry about that. Had to grab something really quick for the next segment. But for now, what I want to focus on is what I think a lot of the wrestling world will be talking about for at least a couple of days. Now, it came down this afternoon that we had a big report from Post Wrestling. Now, you know there are different levels to reportage in wrestling. If you see something reported by Post Wrestling, you can pretty much assume that it's as of high quality and accuracy as anyone else in the business. It's going to be well researched. And this came to us from Brandon Thurston of Post Wrestling. So earlier today, in fact, Dave Meltzer dropped a little bit of a teaser. Now, he's not the one that reported this out, but he said that a bombshell was about to drop. And that could mean anything. We've had false teases before, and depending on your perspective, you may or may not think this is a bombshell, but this is definitely a significant story. So this afternoon, Brandon Thurston published this via Post Wrestling with the headline, "I will be your greatest partner. How Vince McMahon's 2022 WWE comeback was anticipated by Endeavor executives." So let me just set the stage here for what we are talking about. There we go. So you can follow along some of the parts of the article as I discuss them. So to get that out of the way. Oh, that doesn't look good. Not me. To give you guys a bit of a brief history lesson, as you may recall, back in the summer of 2022, Vince McMahon abruptly resigned from WWE. Now, all this happened very, very quick, with the implication that his presence was no longer the most valuable thing for the company, for shareholders, because of an impending lawsuit and new information that was going to come out. Now, we knew there was something nefarious of nature when it came out, but it could also have been your standard fair affair, something that may be unethical, but not necessarily something that you need to be taken to the woodshed for. With all that said, it became very, very clear that Vince McMahon could not remain in his position of power within WWE. Now, going back several years, even before this, there was always talks of there being a sale. The idea of a sale was laughed at, I think, when it was first brought up. But then after you saw the hiring of Nick Khan and some of the moves that WWE made in the early 2020s, I think it became apparent that a sale was at least a possibility. But everyone kind of assumed that Vince McMahon would never give up power, therefore he would never sell. Well, according to this article, he never had any intentions of giving up. According to this article, he never had any intentions of giving up power, even if the sale was to be completed. Let me read you this opening paragraph. And again, please check out this entire article over at postwrestling.com. When Vince McMahon announced his retirement from WWE in July 2022 amid allegations of sexual misconduct, a top executive at Endeavor was already telling a colleague that very day that McMahon's departure would be temporary. He would return and that a company transaction of WWE could be imminent, forecasting the eventual merger with UFC. So, what did he know? How did he know it? Why did he know it? And how do we know that he knew it? Well, a lot of this information comes from unsealed court filings. Now, court, you ask, what's going on? Well, some former shareholders are actually suing TKO and members of WWE, both current and past, of the board, of course. Think Nick Khan, Paul Levesque, Stephanie McMahon, all kind of named around here, of not necessarily having the most open and transparent process for the sale, thus not maximizing the total value of the sale. According to the reporting, this was written by Ari Emanuel, TKO president now, and then some kind of big wheel within Endeavor. And this is the day that Vince resigned back in 2022. Nick and Stephanie are going to take over the Nick and Stephanie are going to take over the WWE for the next 9 months, Shapiro wrote, referring to Nick Khan and Stephanie McMahon, who will become CEOs that day. Vince will be back with a new board, or he will take the company private, or he will sell / coming to us. The race is on, Shapiro added. The courtship is on. Oh, how right he was. Now, it wasn't 9 months. Turned out to be 6 months is all it took. Now, if you recall, there was the period of time where it seemed like Vince had just gone away and everything was kind of at a standstill, but he was kind of in the background. And then we got word that he was coming back. Well, what happened in that interim time is where a lot of this focuses on. hold on one second. Let me find the next part of what happened behind the scenes. So apparently, the day Vince resigned initially, he sent out a series of emails, one to the staff and one to the executives. He says this: even though I'm no longer employed by WWE as of 4 p.m. Eastern, I'm taking the liberty of using corporate email 1 hour after my official departure. He wrote, I hope it's all right, lol. I understand this has been a painful and arduous process for all of us to reach a conclusion, he told the board. I have the utmost respect for each and every one of you and ultimately support your decision making in an effort to protect shareholder value. That decision would be Vince being gone, Vince being away, Vince being a net negative for the company. Okay, and this is the really juicy part for me. Remember, I told you about there being co-defendants in this and people that are named, and what exactly are they accused of? How is this sale exactly massaged, according to this reporting? Goes on to write, less than 2 weeks after McMahon left the company, he had led. Excuse me. Less than 2 weeks after McMahon left the company he had led for decades, communications records show Emmanuel McMahon arranging an in-person meeting at the steakhouse in New York on August 10th, 2022. McMahon said he would bring along with him WWE's then co-CEOs, his daughter Stephanie McMahon and Nick Khan. At that point, McMahon had no formal role at WWE, but he continued to be in the company's largest and most controlling shareholder. His only formal power during this time was voting control. However, that entailed that any company scale or merger would require his support. And that's what we were always told. If he ever had any power, or if he would come back, it would be to facilitate the sale, and that he did have some say over the sale. Now, there's no actual law, I guess, against these meetings happening, but what they allege in this claim is that due to McMahon's embattled position amid scandal, his interest in staying in power at WWE, his purported friendship with Emmanuel, and his voting control, followed by his return to the board, the scale process was slanted into a foregone conclusion and wasn't a genuine effort to determine WWE's full value, thus financially harming investors, securing McMahon's personal future with the company he just returned to, they allege, and was put above making the best deal for investors. Even reaching out to Emmanuel right after he was let go, saying, I will be your greatest partner. Now, as you recall, Vince McMahon did eventually come back into power at the start of 2023. He actually used his power to fire the right board members and install himself back in control, presumably with the idea that he was the only one that can get WWE through a sale. As Post reports, months later, after a few tense formal emails between McMahon and WWE's board around the holidays in early January 2023, McMahon used his controlling voting power to unilaterally return to the company as a board member. He immediately rearranged the board's membership and announced the company would explore a sale process. The event Shapiro anticipated back in July. Stephanie McMahon and other directors resigned, and Vince McMahon was reestablished as WWE chairman. Remember, we thought at the time that this was essentially going to be Stephanie McMahon's big exodus from the company, and she might never be seen again. And this was like really, really interesting palace intrigue at the time, almost like a Succession storyline. Now, it goes on to say that there were actual multiple bidders that were interested in purchasing WWE, but it seemed like only the Endeavor group was given a fair shake. Now, of course, it was voted upon earlier that Vince McMahon was a detriment to the company. But that's not exactly what the official filings of the company at the time said. During conversations on March 23rd and March 24th, 2023, involving representatives for WWE and Endeavor, Endeavor's representatives emphasized to WWE's reps that the governance proposals were fundamental to Endeavor's thesis for pursuing a transaction with WWE in light of, among other things, Endeavor's belief that Mr. McMahon's continued leadership would be critical to the value created and driving Endeavor's desire to engage in the transaction. In that agreeing to increase WWE's security pro forma equity ownership in the combined company to the 51-49 split that had been proposed by WWE was conditioned upon, and both changes the requirement by Endeavor to the governance arrangement set forth by the March 2023 Endeavor term sheet. What they're saying here is Vince McMahon was apparently considered an absolute valuable part, an essential part of being in the company and this company selling and them maximizing their value, despite, from the outside perception, the value of the company going way up with Vince McMahon gone. Now speaking to an investor for another firm that was highly interested in the purchase of the company, Liberty CEO Greg Maffei said, "Looks like they've been cooking this up for a while." Barada wrote, excuse me, let me rephrase all that. So, in an exchange between investment guys, basically, look like they've been cooking this one up for a while, Barda wrote, sharing a link to a news article about the deal. Yep, pre-wired, Maffei replied. Maffei didn't elaborate, but his comment can be read as expressing that much of the transaction was already in place before the formal process began. And that is really what is at stake here. Was this an actual bid process? Was there an actual sale? Was the WWE stock maximized to its fullest potential with the sale? Or was the sale done so that Vince McMahon could retain power? So he can remain atop of WWE, running it. Maybe not running everything the way he had done previously, but even fitting into a corporate structure and being the head man in charge, not letting himself be taken out by any allegations, any whispers, or anything else. So why is any of this important to any of us? Like, what do we care about all this corporate merger stuff and what it means? Well, I think it's actually important just to know who is in charge, what their values are, and where they stand on things. So, post Vince McMahon, there's been several times where WWE has tried to present themselves as being in a post Vince McMahon era. From a booking perspective, from a workplace perspective, this is supposed to be a new WWE, a corporate friendly WWE in a different way than what that meant in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s, and that Vince was far away. There's even reported in here that Vince was consulted about the booking of WrestleMania in 2023, which, if you recall, there was reported about fear that Vince was close by and that he was influencing the booking. And we have your text messages saying that he at least was getting his hands involved and communicating with the major players. So what this says to me is that in that time period, they never really cut Vince loose, which probably isn't a shock to you, but it just kind of confirms it. But here's the real question. What is the role of the noble WWE? What is the role of the noble members of the WWE court that have been there all along, that initially voted Vince out, that stayed in and supposedly reclaimed the company, but maybe were in cahoots the whole time and maybe arranged the whole thing for Vince to retain his complete power? And maybe, just maybe, the actual criminal parts of the Janelle Grant investigation, everything that got out, just tripped that up enough to get Vince out of the picture, but nothing in the structure of how anything was supposed to be run has essentially changed. Big story. A lot to get to. We're going to be discussing it, and I think everyone within wrestling will be discussing it for the next couple of days. But I kind of want to just give a rundown of that and give some of my takes of why this could be important. All right. So, I am going to disappear for a second. Check it out. But you can still hear me. I know you can. Hi, everyone. As you can see, I got very formally dressed up. And I really, really wanted to welcome you all to the first annual. Ugh. I really wanted to welcome all of you to the first annual Robbies, the most prestigious award show in all of professional wrestling. Now, the Robbies isn't like any other award show where we go down the nominees and we think about what was great and it being an honor to be here. We talk about match of the year, show of the year, wrestler of the year, blah, blah, blah. We're going to get to many of those things, but I thought we'd just use this as a time to discuss some of these things throughout the year, to debate some of these things that happen throughout the year, and maybe it'll provide us a guide and a roadmap going forward for next year. Now, I created a set of categories that I think you guys will enjoy. These categories, again, are not the typical categories, but it should provide you with some context to what it is we're talking about. That's my issue with awards shows. Sometimes awards are a little too broad and they don't always explain what they mean. And I do want to clarify for these awards, they're mostly focused on, almost exclusively focused on the two big American companies, AEW and WWE. If you expanded this to the indies and to international, the result would be a lot different. But if you take umbrage with any of this, you could just let me know down in the comment section or in the chat. All right. So, the first category at the Robbies. I really wish I got some sound for this. Match with the most intrigue. Now, what makes this different than your typical match of the year? Well, match of the year is never really defined. Is it the match with the most amazing action? Is it the match with the most amazing story? Or is it the match that you were the most invested in? Well, for the sake of this list, what I'm going to say, for the sake of this award, I'm going to say the match with the most intrigue is the match that kind of had you at the edge of your seat, that has you watching the entire time, that has you watching very, very intently. So very heavily storyline related. And what my vote for the match of the year with the most intrigue, how could it be anything else but Mox versus Hangman from All In, Texas. Now, this match, we all know, right? It was an overbooked, violent affair. And that's exactly what this feud, storyline, and night called for. Despite what the critics who don't watch like to say, would have you believe about this match and about a lot of things within AEW, just because this match was so violent, it wasn't devoid of any sort of storytelling. Now, I'm not advocating that this match become a template or an excuse to do ultra-violent matches in main event. No. What I think this match should serve as the example of why wrestling companies should reserve the right to occasionally do ultra-violence. This match shows you what that kind of style of pro wrestling can accomplish if it's handled with care. And it's unfair. This match will always be compared to the WrestleMania 40 main event. And essentially, it's kind of the same match on a little bit of a smaller stage. But unlike the bigger WWE match, all of the cameos in this thing actually seemed to make sense. And there were a ton of them, tying all kinds of threads together, but at least they were all related to the match. They weren't just cameos for the sake of cameos. and it really added to the storytelling. Although I think there was only really two that really mattered. And I forgot that Danielson got involved here. That might be the last piece of wrestling physicality we ever see from Bryan Danielson. So we got to hold on to it. But the cameos that really mattered were Darby Allin coming in from his Mount Everest trip, finally. Coming in just a little too late, Darby. You know what, Darby? Next time you go to scale Mount Everest, why don't you go just a little bit faster so that you can make it back in time for one of the biggest storylines of the year? But the cameo I think that was the most important and was the best part of the storytelling here was the cameo of one Swerve Strickland. Storyline that still hasn't really been paid off. But this was a much better and intriguing payoff than I'll be your shield. I'll take you around Cowboy over I'll be your shield any day, even though that other match might have been the bigger match. Of all the things that AEW inherited from WCW and early era TNA, maybe the worst was their inability to deliver on big matches after big builds or big finishes after big matches. This match, though, was nothing but satisfying payoffs, so it checked all of those matches. It was the most satisfying of satisfying payoffs, and let's be honest, wrestling kind of hasn't been the same this year since. All right. So congratulations. The Academy thanks you. You gave a great speech. And back to your seats. Okay. Next category. Moves match of the year. Now, this is a distinctly different category than intrigue match of the year. Moves match of the year, I think you could argue would be something in other publications. Work rate match of the year, worker match of the year, technical match of the year. But I'm going to call it moves match of the year. And what am I selecting for moves match of the year? Well, this one, it's pretty easy for me. It is not on here. Well, I don't have the graphic up for some reason. It didn't make it in. Oh, wait. There it is. My moves match of the year would be the month before Hangman took on Mox, and that would be Hangman taking on Will Ospreay at Double or Nothing in Phoenix to earn the right to face Mox. Somehow, this was the first singles match that these two ever had, and I don't know how that was possible. But this really had the feel of a great conference championship game or series. You know, the type of thing that this may be actually where they're settling the championship. And I know the championship is bigger in the next round, but these are the two best of the best fighting to get to the biggest prize. Now, there were only 2 official weeks of build to this epic encounter. After all, this was the final of the Owen Hart Foundation tournament. But this didn't need weeks of contrived angst and build. They did enough with one promo in Albuquerque and months of character development for Hangman to seal this match as an absolute classic. Now, just because it's not the most intriguing match of the year doesn't mean it wasn't extremely intriguing and you weren't hanging on every move that they had here. There was plenty of danger in drama in this classic matchup. And it had the kind of false finishes that were really more about one-upsmanship than just doing them for the sake of doing them. At the time, we heard the reporting that both men were lobbying for the other to win and the creative decisions were going back and forth. Ultimately, though, Tony made the right choice here. It just really worked out location-wise, how the storyline was going, and when you look at what happened with the injuries later on, this was 100% the right choice. And let's be honest, maybe the most rewatchable match you will find this year. It's available right now on HBO Max. It's one of the most recent things from an AEW pay-per-view that's available on there. I would go check this match out immediately if you haven't seen it in a while. You would swear that this match is only 20 minutes long, and then you look at the file, and it's like an hour long. An amazing, amazing piece of work that these two put on. All right. Moving along. All right. Now, this is a hell of a category, hell of a wordy category, but show that felt the biggest in the moment. This is not necessarily show of the year. This is just what show felt like the most important. What was the can't miss wrestling event of the year? What had the most consequence? What was the focus of everything this year? And I'm going to say this year's winner for show that felt the biggest happened earlier this month. Saturday night's main event in December, John Cena's last match. At 2 nights this year, WrestleMania was one night too long. But it's hard to argue that this wasn't like the WrestleMania Night 3 main event, because this really felt like the next chapter in that storyline. Everything around John Cena's retirement tour probably took up most of our attention this past year, no matter how you want to slice it. But it was all building up to this one night, and there's never really been anything like it within WWE. Like Ric Flair and HBK did have epic send-offs, but they also lost retirement stipulation matches leading up to those matches. So those retirements did technically, from a kayfabe standpoint, come out of nowhere and weren't necessarily these big, long-out planned things. Hell, even earlier this year, they just kind of announced that Goldberg would be having his last match, and they had about a month worth of build to it. It just kind of happened on a Saturday night's main event card. Even the greatest retirement maybe in wrestling history last year in 2024 in AEW with Sting's last match was still built around a major pay-per-view. Not this. Even the matches that didn't involve John Cena on this night were supposed to be representations of John Cena. This was the John Cena wrestling night. And WWE approached this as like a WrestleMania type event. And you knew it too. Once WrestleMania just became one of the stops along the road of the retirement tour, you knew that perhaps the actual show would be overshadowed by John Cena's retirement event. And from WrestleMania to SummerSlam, John Cena's main event, heel turn, and his run was the central focus of the company. And it was a disaster, and it all meant nothing. But the thing about retconning it right before SummerSlam is it allowed people to then jump right into what they wanted to really do, and that was celebrate Cena for at least half a year. And that went okay. Nonetheless, like I said, WWE treated John Cena's last match like the biggest night on the calendar year, hosting like a WrestleMania-like environment. And in my opinion, that's why the audience unloaded their year of frustration onto the company in the aftermath of that card. You put on that same card in those same circumstances without the year of baggage that the fans had just faced, and I bet you that night would have been interpreted a whole hell of a lot differently. All right. Next up. Show with the best matches. And if you're paying attention, this probably isn't the biggest shocker in the world to you, but it's once again All In Texas. Think about some of the questions people had going in to All In Texas. Like, can Toni Storm have a great follow-up to her epic series with Mariah May? Can Mercedes Moné live up to her epic push? After facing such dire health issues, can Kenny Omega still deliver? Would Okada ever live up to his hype that preceded him prior to joining AEW? Could Omega Okada itself ever actually live up to the hype of its previous matches? Would Hangman versus Mox be needlessly violent? And would they book the ending well? Well, we got answers to most of those, and whatever like the good answer for AEW was, they pretty much got confirmation on all of those things. That was the triple main event, and I focused on those. There's also the tag match that was very important and very good on that show. But the show was also kind of needlessly long. Could have tested everyone's patience, but luckily, because it aired so much earlier in the day than these shows normally air, I think everyone was able to at least stay alert for it and engage long enough, although this was a ridiculously long wrestling show. That's why it's not the overall best show of the year, not the most watchable show, but it was the show with the best matches. And let me talk about some of those main events. For one, you had Mercedes Moné versus Toni Storm. Two colorful characters that were locked up in a mat classic. They spend most of this match. There's some of the head games, there's some high spots, but it's mostly them exchanging holds, and it's very, very entertaining. This was a great build to lead up to this match, and they paid off with a really good match, including Mercedes' first loss in AEW, and starting this narrative of Mercedes being able to win everywhere, to win the title everywhere, to win every title everywhere except for the main title within AEW. you also had the latest installment of Omega Okada. The unquestioned worst match of their series was one of the best matches in company history. The match, though, it did kind of bother me at the time. To me, that match represents the ultimate passage of time. It was the first time that I could look back at late 20 teens non WWE wrestling in particular and look at it with a real nostalgia lens, thinking about what could have been or what used to be. But at least these guys still had it. And again, these guys on their worst day are better than most guys on their best days. It's also, quite frankly, the end of Omega as a big time singles player. He still may have bigger matches, but in a lot of ways, this was kind of the end. And it was a fitting send off. Hopefully, Okada can have the follow up that we know he can. And of course, I don't need to talk about it anymore. You have the main event between Hangman and Mox. Hangman and Mox. The series finale to the biggest story that they were telling in the company at the time. Should also mention, because it's not going to get mentioned here and it wasn't part of this show, but that same weekend, you also had the great Bandito Takeshita match for ROH that Friday. What a wrestling weekend that was. Maybe I should go on to the next category. Yeah. So speaking of that weekend, most watchable show. All In was a great show, but it was not necessarily a watchable show. Heck, even its rewatch valuable is very segmented. It could take you like 4 days to rewatch that thing. It's like the blood in, blood out of wrestling pay-per-views. The most watchable show came not that long after this. In fact, it came the same weekend. WWE's Evolution show. On a weekend full of wrestling, there's no way that anyone anticipated that the last WWE show, this is WWE, the place where things can get a little sleepy sometimes, that they would keep pace and arguably surpass all the other great wrestling that had happened that weekend. The first Evolution show that happened many years ago was pure, uncut PR offset to the fact that they had this new controversial relationship with Saudi Arabia. This was less of that and more just a card that a lot of the women's storylines were culminating on. Now, this wasn't even the best built card, but it had a lot less baggage than I felt like the last Evolution show did, so it had more of a fair shot. And if you look at it up and down this card, perhaps I should show it to you. Yeah. There we go. Across this card, you had that great triple threat with Becky Lynch really in command. And you had the excellent main event with Io Sky and Rhea Ripley. Subtly, one of the best storylines in WWE all year, and there still really hasn't been a culmination and resolution. After a weekend of bloated wrestling, very good, but very bloated wrestling, this was a way to end it. This was a way to appreciate wrestling, to kick your feet up and have engaging storylines, good matches, high spots, all fit into a reasonable time span. At a time when the booking really felt like in WWE, it was shortchanging the women, they really showed that they are still one of the best rosters in all of wrestling, and when given the proper direction, they can really cook. Okay, now we'll get into some individual awards. First up, wrestler with the best matches. Now, here's the issue here with wrestler with the best matches. And of course, I'm gonna say Hangman Page wins. This award could go to Will Ospreay every year. In fact, this could just be the Will Ospreay award. It's basically the best bout machine award, which right now Will Ospreay falls into that category. But Will Ospreay did miss significant time this year, and so I'm going to say he doesn't win the award. Let's be honest. Like I said, Ospreay could win the award every single year. It's like Jordan in the 90s, LeBron in the 2010s, or Jokic nowadays. Ospreay is default kind of the best wrestler in the world, but that would just be straight up boring. So we're going to pick someone else. And let's just look at Hangman's pay-per-view run this year. He has, going down the list here, He defeated MJF at Revolution, Ospreay at Double or Nothing, Mox at All In Texas, MJF again at Forbidden Door, took down Kyle Fletcher in a really underrated match at All Out, beat Samoa Joe at Wrestle Dream, lost it to him later at Full Gear, and then came up just short in the Fatal 4-Way at World's End. He might not have had quite all of the technical classics that Ospreay had, and maybe they didn't reach all of those heights. But you could follow the entirety of that company just through his matches. Nothing else. It goes through him. He was the most important wrestler with the most important matches this year. Next category. Most engaging wrestler. Who made me want to tune into wrestling shows the most this year? I will say this was a little bit more difficult than I thought, thanks to a late push by none other than Dominic Mysterio. Dominic Mysterio was very close to being the most engaging wrestler of this year. Dominic Mysterio has what it takes and seemingly is going to be the future of the company. He's one of the few bright spots that they have. One of the few guys like under 35 that they're giving any push to right now in the company. And his character has been entertaining from almost end to end of the year. The problem is there's a lot of crap with the Judgment Day that sometimes just brings everything down, and he gets brought down with that. That is not the case with this next wrestler. This next wrestler, who I have as my most engaging wrestler of the year, was the timeless one, Toni freaking Storm. Absolutely. Now, she probably had the best character in wrestling a year ago while it was being developed, but this year was about making good on all of that development. Whether it was her crazy journey with Mariah May, the epic square-off she had with Mercedes, the title feud she had with Statlander, or her tag team rise with Mina Shirakawa, she had the audience interested the whole time. Whether it was matches, whether it was segments, whether it was big-time things, whether it was small-time things. She has the perfect balance of good match content with an interesting character. Almost to the point of being outlandish, but if you pay close enough attention to it, I think we can understand what's going on with that character. Toni Storm has honestly joined an elite group of wrestling that right now is only also occupied by Becky Lynch. Her and Becky Lynch are the only two figures in wrestling. They're booking proof and they are push proof. Just give them something and they will make it work. They will make it entertaining. But this year, Toni gets the nod. Oops, spoiler. All right, I've talked about it enough, but my storyline of the year is Hangman's redemption arc, and it should be. This was great pro wrestling storytelling, full stop. It's relatable as any storyline in wrestling can ever be. But it was also a surrogate for the plight of the promotion. TNA must be kicking themselves that after all of these years of trying to run this exact storyline for the soul of the company, for control of the company, for the face of the company, for what it means, and all these storylines that no one has ever cared about, AEW finally landed that storyline and landed it absolutely correctly. AEW getting pushed out of their comfy venues due to competition, meaning London and Las Vegas, having to settle for Dallas and Phoenix, just made the setting for the Cowboy to take over even better. Putting it in the Southwest just makes it that much better. And Mox being the final boss here worked better than I think most people realized. I don't know when the change happened, but at some point, Mox went from having like go away heat as the champion to just having actual heel heat. It started with these accusations that what they were doing with him was going to kill and devalue the AEW title. But actually, by not seeing the AEW title and just seeing the pursuit for it and it not happening, actually put a ton of value on that title, made that maybe the most important thing in the world. There was a lot of hostility towards Mox, but maybe that hostility should have been directed towards Cope. Just something to chew on. And it had to be Hangman that was the one to take it off. I know we talked about earlier that Ospreay was in consideration, but it had to be Hangman, who represents the one wrestler on the babyface side of things most associated with the homegrown potential of that company. Although, I mean, I will always wonder how badly did Tony Khan want Darby to be in that spot? Everest. It'll get you every time. And for Hangman, the story was real. Even if you're unaware of all the backstage shenanigans that happened in AEW over the past couple of years, you could just follow Hangman's character from a kayfabe perspective, and it's a great journey. He's the ultimate babyface now, but he had to go through the darkest of dark places as a heel to get there, to kind of go through his redemption, completing a full and complete arc. Now his opponents from that night and everyone he wrestled around, they kind of all got to do the same, but the roster was completely decimated when he took over, so his storyline kind of gets contained to there. And that was the best storyline of the year, but it didn't follow the year all the way through. I will say in the fallout of this storyline, maybe his storyline hasn't been the best, but where we are with Moxley now is super interesting, and we only get there because of the downfall that happened during this match. One more category, folks. Let me take a swig of water. There was no costume change there. That wasn't anything. All right. Last category for 2025. Story of the year. Until the day I die, this will be our favorite category. Now, story of the year, think of this as wrestling news story of the year. You had your storyline of the year, but this is the wrestling news item that was the most interesting, most engaging, and most consequential. And it's probably not going to be a shock here. The story of the year. There you see all the players. Yep. WWE burning their goodwill. If you've been a fan of pro wrestling going back to either one of the boom periods they had at the end of the last century, you are well aware of how fleeting and how finite the moments of success, mainstream acceptance, and overall smooth sailing can be in wrestling. It took WWE 2+ decades to right the ship post-Attitude Era. But just like that, all the momentum seemed like it's completely stalled, and all the goodwill is completely gone after 2025. They spent 20 years trying to dig out of that. And they spent the last few years really positioning themselves as a hip, cool company that was on the cutting edge of entertainment. But that's where everything kind of went into the wrong direction. The year started off on the wrong foot with the Raw debut on Netflix. And if you look at it, that edition of Raw really is emblematic of everything that kind of happened this year. We didn't know it, but all the signs were there. I mean, look at everything that happened with The Rock that night and him going back and forth with characters, hanging out with Cody, and then almost never being seen again. But the doubt, I would say, really started to creep in around the Royal Rumble, with Jey Uso winning that Rumble. Triple H's booking was already being questioned towards the end of 2024 for being a little too safe. And I don't think you can say Jey Uso was necessarily a safe option, but it was one of Trips' guys. And it started a conversation that's never really ended. And then they pull off the angle of all angles at Elimination Chamber, and they fumble it and pass the blame right out of WrestleMania. Yep, that's what The Rock was doing there, going on a Pat McAfee show, passing the blame, because that's what he does all day long. The fumble, the heel turn, all of that just dragged the promotion down for about 6 months. And we all know about the lack of follow-through that happened there. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, the PLEs feel like they're getting a little bit shorter, and there stops being like really good quality matches on these things. We're getting like average good house show matches on PLEs. And if you want to go to one of these PLEs, you're going to have to spend historic money. They'll tell you how historic it is. Historic money having to attend one of these events. Deciding to stay home is cheaper, just not as cheap as it was last year. Now you need a Netflix subscription for Raw, a cable subscription to watch SmackDown, broadcast television access to watch the first few Saturday Night main events and weekly NXT shows. You needed Peacock at the beginning of the year to watch PLEs. Now you just need Peacock for NXT PLEs. And apparently, quarterly Saturday night's main event, if that's worth it for you. But no other WWE content, because that's all gone. Good luck. Hopefully it ends up on the vault. Oh, and you need the right kind of ESPN subscription to watch the PLEs now. If not, you could just fork over $30 a month for these main roster PLEs that are increasingly shorter and of lesser quality. Oh, and those PLEs, the ones that are in ESPN, they're horrible, and they prominently feature Brock Lesnar. Please, please, please take my freaking money. WWE just became really fan-unfriendly this year. Fan-unfriendly in a different way than they had been in the past. Going back to late-era events, they were fan-unfriendly in booking the people that they wanted to book. They still do that. Maybe you don't have the backlash for the live events, but talk to LA Knight. They still very, very much do that. But they're also hitting you at the other points. We laugh about the saying that Vince McMahon was booking the house shows for families, but it is true because they don't do the house shows anymore. There were other pieces of access. WWE is trying to accomplish what Vince always tried to accomplish, to prove that they could appeal to a more affluent audience. And maybe they can, and maybe it is sustainable, and maybe the rest of us will get left behind. But that doesn't change the fact that WWE built their brand on kind of being an accessible brand. And now they're a premium luxury brand. Will all of us come along for the ride? Are we stuck here? Are we the victims of monopoly? Or do we have another choice? To me, where TKO goes and does with all this bad will going forward, that will be the biggest story of 2026. Thank you for sticking with me, folks. A little bit of a rough start with the Vince story. I might cut that out of here. I may re-record that. This was fun, though. I like doing the Robbies. My journey through pro wrestling. No one else's. My perspective. I was going to do a year preview, but I feel like last week when I did the wish list thing, that kind of served as the year in preview. So I'll just stick to regularly scheduled programming next week. Probably on Tuesday. We won't go Monday. This is a special edition on Monday, but we've kept the weekly schedule 4 in a row now since doing this thing independently. Next week, we'll have a few things to talk about. But let me give you an idea about some of the threads I've got coming in. I like years that end with 6s. I think they're pretty significant in wrestling. 2016, significant. 1996, significant. 2006, significant. Specifically, 2006, 96 a little bit. 2001 is also kind of an anniversary date coming in. And I want to look at how we got to December to Dismember. I want to look at how we got to Survivor Series 01. Hell, I want to look at how we got to Survivor Series 96. How did we get to Survivor Series 2016? All the paths led to these infamous pay-per-views at these pivotal years. So I think every week we're going to take a little bit of history from one of those 4 years and thread our way through wrestling history. Also, we are coming up on a very, very important anniversary of a very, very important video once posted by Kip James. We are going to break all of that down next week. Guys, I will talk to you next week. Thank you for supporting me late into the year. Have a great year. Have a great week. I will talk to you.